Hello, everyone, and Merry Christmas. Welcome to this week's episode of Touchdown Tuesday Christmas Edition. I am your co host, Ian DeMars, alongside co host Ryan Solomon. And Ryan, we're just so close to the playoffs finally being here in the NFL. We had some exciting action coming week 16. And like I said, also close to the playoffs. How do you feel right now, just knowing that we're a mere week or so away from the playoffs starting?
I mean, I'm pretty excited. It's always good to see the first round of the playoffs because that's when the most teams are in. You get those wild card games where you never know what's going to happen. And we actually did have some really entertaining games this week, and we have some interesting storylines heading into week 17 with a couple of teams still alive for the playoff hunt.
Yeah, definitely. There were a lot of crazy games that happened, and a lot, as you did mention, that did affect the playoff races. And there were two key ones that would stand out. Very close games between a couple of division rivals. First one being the Houston Texans, which lost a close game on the road after a last-second field goal by Jake Elliott and the Philadelphia Eagles to keep them in the playoff hunt. While another team in that division, the Indianapolis Colts, were able to squeak past the New York Giants. And now it's an interesting scenario for three of those four teams because now the Texans, it looks like, could get the division. Colts are fighting to get into the playoffs and have a must-win game next week, or they are out. And then the Eagles also have a slim chance. So, as we said, those three teams stay alive. Who do you think is of those three should be worried the most?
Well, here's how it breaks down for these teams. And there's a lot of interesting storylines with these teams altogether. So Colts Titans, it's going to boil down to whichever team wins that game. That team is in the playoffs as the sixth seed in the AFC. Houston already technically clinched their spot in the playoffs, so they're not concerned about this. And then if you look at the Eagles get into the playoffs with a win and a Vikings loss. So the Vikings play the Bears. The Bears have already wrapped up the division. They've already wrapped up their seed. They're not going to be going up or down unless Los Angeles loses. So what that brings us to is Eagles and Vikings fighting for a playoff spot and Colts, Tennessee fighting for a playoff spot. So and there's Baltimore in there, but we'll get to that later. So let's talk about the Eagles for a second. This is one of the weirdest teams in the NFL this year because they won the Super Bowl last year, switched quarterbacks and assumed they would be better. Turned out to be significantly worse with their star quarterback, Carson Wentz. Go back to Nick Foles because they decide that their season is not going to be saved at this point, and then suddenly reel off wins and now are on the precipice of making the playoffs. So Nick Foles today, here are his numbers: 35 of 49, 471 yards and 4 touchdowns. This guy is crazy right now. He's rejuvenated this team, and they look like a team that's dangerous. And if they get into the playoffs, I don't think that any team is going to want to play them in the first round.
Yeah, I would definitely agree on that point just because, as you said, Nick Foles is playing like he should be the starting quarterback of that team. You look at the way he played in the majority of the playoffs last year. He played some big games in the end towards the regular season as well, and then he struggled a little bit earlier on this season. Yet they still had they had a decent record before Carson Wentz came over. And you know what? They've only lost one game this year with Nick Foles as their starting quarterback. So you have to be feeling good right now if you are the Philadelphia Eagles. You need to win next week. You need to get some help for Minnesota to lose. So they do have that chance to sneak in. The one thing that does kind of put a question mark for me, at least for them, I would say is the running game because it's just been so inconsistent of who's going to be the lead back each week. Some weeks, as of recently, it's been Josh Adams, but some weeks it could be Corey Clement, some weeks it could be Darren Sproles, some weeks it could be Wendell Smallwood. Jay Ajayi, when he was healthy, was that guy. It's a little inconsistent for them. Obviously, they have some talented running backs, and they want to get all of them share, but they need to figure out who's going to be their guys when it comes to winning them games for the postseason if they were to get there. So I think if they're able to get that figured out, then yeah, this team can be a threat in the postseason. But for right now, I think that's their one question mark.
Yeah, that's a valid point that you raise. And I think that this is kind of how the running game was last year, though, too, is they had Jay Ajayi, who, he was kind of supposed to be the lead back. They didn't end up leaning on him as much as as they could have, and they kind of went to more of a rotation. So that's kind of where they're at this year again. And when Nick Foles puts up those kind of numbers and that defense is actually holding teams out of the end zone at a better rate than they were earlier in the year with Carson Wentz, I think it's a team that still holds some merit as a potential candidate to make it far in the playoffs. Because if you look at some of the other teams, the Los Angeles Rams haven't really been keeping anybody out of the end zone, neither have the Kansas City Chiefs. So there's a lot of teams that are pretty highly rated out there that don't really have the defensive statistics to back it up and rely on the offense. And that seems to be kind of what the Eagles have been doing lately, but the defense has looked better. And I don't think that we can understate the impact that having Nick Foles at quarterback seems to have on the defense, which is very strange.
Yeah, and I think that's going to be a question, I think, for the Eagles, no matter what happens. If the Eagles somehow get to the playoffs or if they just win and don't make it in next week, do you think they face a quarterback controversy going into next season?
I honestly think that there is a quarterback controversy there, and it's not just how the two quarterbacks are playing, but it's also durability. Nick Foles has gotten injured in the past. He had a collarbone injury. I think he actually broke his collarbone at some point, but for the duration of his Eagles career, he's been pretty reliable, and Carson Wentz has been the exact opposite of that, constantly being injured, going out of the game, not being reliable in situations where you need a quarterback who's going to be durable. And so I think there is a legitimate quarterback controversy, but it seems like the front office and the coach, Doug Peterson, kind of just say, oh, Carson Wentz is our guy. But you have to look at the statistics, and this team is significantly better with Nick Foles, or at least they have been this year.
Yeah, it's kind of tough because you look at Nick Foles, he has the contract situation is interesting. So basically, the second year is an optional year, but basically, if the Eagles decide to want him back, it's basically up to Nick Foles if he does want to pick up that option. So if there's a few different options. They agree to it and he comes back. They can agree to it and try and trade him. If they don't agree to it, they can franchise tag him, possibly look to trade him that way. I think Nick Foles, we had talked about it how going into last offseason, how there was a decent chance he could get traded. I think the way he's played at the end of this year, I think there's a even better chance that he could get traded this offseason. You look at some of the teams that are going to be facing some quarterback questions. The Giants, the Jacksonville Jaguars, the Miami Dolphins, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers all have quarterback question marks. So I could easily see Nick Foles possibly getting traded to any one of those teams if he ends up playing well in the last game.
Yeah, what's weird with Foles, though, is we've seen him with other teams before. We saw him with the Rams. He didn't really do much. It seems like there's just something about him and the Philadelphia Eagles that just works together. I don't exactly know what it is. I don't know that I can explain it. It's kind of like Matt Flynn and the Packers, where if he goes anywhere else, he's terrible, but he can win games with Green Bay. That's kind of Nick Foles and the Eagles. He's meant to be with the Philadelphia Eagles. I think any team that trades for him is going to find out that he's not really that good, but there's just something about him in that city that makes it work.
Yeah, and I was, if you were listening, for those who weren't listening to the game on Sunday night, there's an interesting thing that I believe it was Chris Collinsworth that said that Nick Foles is actually contemplating retirement after the one bad year he had with the previously then St. Louis Rams. And remember, he was contemplating retirement, and then he ended up going to Kansas City to play with Andy Reid, the guy who kind of helped spark him when he was in Philadelphia. So he kind of kept Nick Foles from retiring. And who knows, if Andy Reid doesn't go back to coaching right away, Nick Foles might not even be playing football at this point.
Yeah, that's a good point also. And we're unfortunately going to have to move on from this topic just because there's so much more we could go into on the history of Nick Foles. But let's talk about another quarterback who had an interesting week in Week 16, and that's Aaron Rodgers. So the week after they're eliminated from the playoffs, Aaron Rodgers puts up huge numbers, scores 2 rushing touchdowns, and leads the Packers back from a deficit to beat the New York Jets in overtime, thus dashing any hope the Packers had of getting a top 10 draft pick. Just joking about that, but it's also true. So Rodgers looked like he was having the time of his life out there playing against the Jets this week for a team that has nothing left to play for. What can you take away from this game? Is this maybe a turning point for the Packers going forward? Is this just them losing stock in the draft for no reason? What can you take away from this game, and is any of it important?
I mean, looking at it, I mean, obviously there's a positive. They didn't lose a road. They had lost every road game this year until this past week. So obviously that's a huge plus for them. And look at it, obviously hurts them when it comes to the draft. Well, you have to remember they get 2 draft picks this year. So even if it is a pick that ends up being in the later, it's looking like it could be somewhere where they had it last year in that 13 to 16 range. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a bad thing if they keep slipping down a little bit because you want what if you have 2 pretty good drafts and this is supposed to be a defensive heavy draft, Packers, you know what, might be able to trade up, use those 2 trade or draft picks as bargaining pieces to get a higher pick, maybe creep into the top 10 or the top 5. But obviously it's a positive because the offense looked, I thought, a lot better this past week. That you do have question marks though, because the defense took a pretty big step back. You're going against a rookie quarterback that's been turnover prone this year. They're on their 3rd-string running back who did get a rushing touchdown. You did hold him in check, but the special teams were terrible this past week. They gave up a kick return for almost 2 kick returns for touchdowns. Only one was given up, but the second one that almost went for a touchdown ended up leading to the field goal that led them into the overtime game. So as much as you want to say it's a positive, there are definitely a lot of negatives to look at. But to see Aaron Rodgers put up a game like he did definitely shows you that he definitely is healthy and definitely is still wanting to do what he can to get his team a win, even though they are out of the picture. But it's a little of both. Like, you're happy they got the win and you're happy he played well, but your defense and special teams took huge steps back this week.
Yeah, that's what I got out of it, is that this was the New York Jets, a team that has struggled all year. They only have 4 wins. The Packers should have been able to dispatch them fairly easily. They weren't able to handle the rookie quarterback, Sam Darnold, and they allowed 38 points. I don't think that there's much positive you can take away from that because we already know that Aaron Rodgers is capable of putting up games like this, especially against bad defenses like the Jets. So it's hard to get really excited about this, but it is nice to see the Packers win after a season that's been so disastrous for them, and there were so many expectations. But that's really all that you can take away from it at this point, is it's nice for them to get a win, but in the long run, it doesn't really do anything positive. If anything, it just shows that this team is in need of a major overhaul and major coaching changes all along that staff.
Yeah.
That's kind of what I took out of it.
Yeah, also a shout out to Jake Kumerow for getting his first NFL touchdown this past week off a 49-yard pass. So shout out to him. So definitely you do see that some of the receivers that they did get that are younger are starting to improve a little bit. St. Brown led them in receiving yards this past week as well. So I would say, even though, like I said, we did talk about a lot of the negatives, we're starting to see these young wide receivers make some big-time plays as well.
Yeah, I think that receiving core could potentially be good in the future. We know what Valdes-Scantling can do. A lot of people around Wisconsin like Kumerow. And then you have St. Brown there, too, who hasn't really done a whole lot this year, but you've seen flashes of it. So there's some good things to look for on offense, hopefully in the future. Jamal Williams had another good game, too. But let's move on to another team that's kind of struggled this year and has actually struggled sort of under the radar, and that's the Pittsburgh Steelers. So throughout most of the year, we kind of wrote the Steelers in, especially me, wrote the Steelers in as a team that could contend for a Super Bowl, a team that would for sure make the playoffs in that division where you have the Browns, the Bengals, and the Ravens. But lo and behold, after a loss to the Saints, which wasn't at all unexpected, but nonetheless, after a loss to the Saints, find themselves out of the playoff picture. And if Baltimore wins this coming week, they're out. So what do you think about the Steelers? I've heard talk about maybe Mike Tomlin getting fired. I don't know if that's a realistic possibility. This team has been good for the past, 2 decades. Do you think it's time to make a change, or do you think that this is just an anomaly with them potentially missing the playoffs?
I don't necessarily think they need to make a change. I mean, you look at that game, Pittsburgh was driving the ball in the fourth quarter, and the guy who tweeted out to people saying that he wasn't going to let fantasy owners down ended up possibly costing some fantasy owners this past week with Juju Smith-Schuster fumbling the ball at the end of the game, which ended up being the the exclamation point in their defeat. But I've noticed this over the last few years, and obviously we see this a lot in the NFL, but Pittsburgh just looks like a mess when it comes to road games. When it seems like they play at home, they seem to be dominant, and it doesn't really seem to be like an issue for them. But some of these road games are in these tough environments just seem to be an issue for them. It's not necessarily too bad in conference, but I mean, you look at this past week, or you look at this past game against the Saints. They lost on the road earlier this year to the Oakland Raiders. I mean, the last couple of years, they've looked like a different team on the road. I'm not necessarily sure why, but Ben Roethlisberger just seems different. And I'm not sure if it's the age factor or what, but something's happening to this team when they go on the road. I'm not sure if maybe they're not getting enough sleep or what exactly it is. The travel is being an issue, but they just look completely different when it comes to road games. But when they're at home, they seem like one of the best teams in the NFL. So I don't necessarily know what this issue is. I just think it's a factor of it's been a weird season for them. Le'Veon Bell not playing at all this year. James Conner being a breakout star for them, but has been out the past few weeks. It's been a weird season for them. I don't necessarily think this is something that's going to cost Mike Tomlin his job. I just think it's one of those odd seasons that we see every once in a while in the NFL.
The only thing about the Steelers that make you really wonder is the quality of the teams that they've lost to. You get the Saints, okay, they lost to the Saints. Saints are the top team in the NFC right now. But you look back at this year, like you said, the Oakland Raiders, they lost to the Denver Broncos, a team that's not close to making the playoffs at all. They gave up a huge lead to the Chargers, which Chargers are a good team, but you still shouldn't blow that kind of lead versus almost anyone that you play. But then you look on the other side and they finally beat the Patriots. It's like this is one of the most up and down seasons that I can remember a team having in recent memory. And it's strange because you think of Mike Tomlin as a good head coach and a guy that's going to manage anything that's going on in his locker room, but maybe that's just not the case. You don't usually see teams that are well coached have this many ups and downs in a season like this, barring weird injuries or strange circumstances. So it does seem like there's something going on with the Steelers, and you do see that every team eventually, other than the Patriots, kind of needs to make a change. Like you look at the Chiefs bringing in Andy Reid after he was in Philadelphia. That situation where he was in Philadelphia for a while, he wasn't a bad coach. He wasn't really diminished at all, but they just needed to make a change, and maybe that's where the Steelers are at.
Yeah, it's just kind of weird, but maybe a change is something that they do need to do. And if they were to do that, do you think that the Steelers would go for someone who doesn't really have much if any head coaching experience in the NFL? Do you think they'd go for a veteran coach like a Mike McCarthy, possibly a Harbaugh from Baltimore, but it's looking like he might stay now, possibly maybe a Marvin Lewis or a Hugh Jackson?
I mean, it's hard to tell with the Steelers. They seem to be a team that kind of goes by the beat of their own drum. They're not afraid to make noise with their hires. So I wouldn't be surprised if they took somebody that didn't have a lot of coaching experience, but Mike McCarthy in Pittsburgh would be very interesting, considering that's where he's from. That's the team he beat in the Super Bowl with the Packers. That would be an interesting situation getting him there.
Yeah, and I do definitely think it depends on what happens this next week. Obviously, if you lose to I believe they play the Bengals this week. If you lose to the Bengals at home, they have a backup quarterback, and they don't have their top three targets on offense, and A.J. Green, Tyler Boyd, and Tyler Eifert. I mean, if you lose to that team, then I think he does deserve to be let go.
Yeah, that would be a tough one to swallow for sure. And they have to hope that Cleveland is able to beat the Ravens and that they're able to pull through against the Bengals. I think that Baltimore-Cleveland at this point, in my eyes, is kind of a pick-em. Could go either way. So they probably have about a 50% chance to make the playoffs still. And I guarantee if they get in, no one's going to be talking about firing Mike Tomlin.
Yeah, definitely for sure. And it'll be if they're able to get some help from Cleveland. You look at Cleveland would actually finish with the record over 500. And you look at out of all things, I don't think no one was really expecting them to not only, obviously people are expecting them to win some games this year, but I don't think no one was expecting this team to actually have a record over 500, and they have that chance now.
I think some people kind of were, because we already looked at that roster last year. We said there's some pieces in place, and given their draft this year, I think people had some expectation for Cleveland. I'm not saying that they expect them to finish above 500, but they at least expected them to win a number of games this year. So I think they've probably gone over what some of the hype was for them, but we still kind of saw this coming to some degree.
Yeah, definitely in the fact that they're on the rise, and this team, could be maybe getting closer and sooner to being a favorite in that division than a lot of people thought. Just because, obviously, Pittsburgh's taken a step back this year since he's basically been where they're at. Baltimore's looked better, but they still have question marks, and Cleveland's starting to look more like a complete team now. So definitely they're on the rise for sure.
Yeah, that's true. But let's talk a little bit more playoffs right now. So if you look at what's going on right now with the playoff picture, there are 4 teams that have not clinched yet that would be in if the season ended today. So that's the Vikings, currently sitting in the 6th spot in the NFC. As we mentioned, if the Eagles win, the Vikings lose, they will drop out. The Eagles will come in. Baltimore is in the 4th spot. And like we mentioned, if they lose and Pittsburgh wins, they will be taken out and replaced by Pittsburgh. And then we have that Indianapolis, Tennessee play-in. Winner goes to the playoffs game. Out of these 3 spots, which one do you think the current occupant will not be in by the time next week is over?
But that's a tough one. Honestly, I could see all the teams that are currently in. Is it Indianapolis that's currently in right now, or is it Tennessee?
It's Indianapolis that's currently in. Indy is currently holding the tiebreak over Tennessee.
I think if we had to pick a team that's the most unlikely, I think it would be Indianapolis. I think that's because of the fact that they have to play on the road in prime time against Tennessee. You look at the other teams that are currently in. The Vikings, I believe, they finished the season off at home. I think it's against the Chicago Bears, which is a tough matchup, but it's a home game, and Kirk Cousins looked better this week on the road. So gives Minnesota a little upside going into that big-time matchup, and you would have to assume that Chicago is going to be resting some of their starters. You look at Baltimore, they first a very hot Cleveland team, but they also play at home, so that gives them a little bit of advantage. And then Tennessee, which is currently out, has the advantage of playing at home. Pittsburgh as well, that's out. So I think that the Colts have the toughest one, but look at a couple weeks ago, they got a huge road win in Tennessee, or not Tennessee, in Houston. So I think that as much as they could be the likely team to pull off a huge win this week, I think that they have the toughest job to do that.
I think that you have a point there, and I think the point also is that with all these other teams, if they lose, another team could still lose and get them into the playoffs. So, like, if you look at the Vikings, let's say the Vikings do lose to the Bears, they still have a chance of the Eagles losing to the Redskins and then still getting in. Indianapolis, if they lose, they are out. There's no backup plan there. So I think that you nailed it there, where they would be the most likely to be out simply because only one thing has to happen for them to be gone from the playoff picture. Those other 2 teams that we mentioned, they can still get in even if they lose. Not likely, because the other teams they're playing should be favored, or the team that is out currently would be favored. But I think that you're right with that one.
Yeah, and it's just crazy what could happen this upcoming week, because there could be a scenario in the AFC where we could see 4 teams tied with the best record. And in that case, I believe it would come. I don't even know how the tiebreaker would work out in that case, because in order for that to happen, obviously the Patriots and the Texans would have to win, and then if the Chiefs and the Chargers were to lose, then I'm not sure how exactly that tiebreaker would work.
Yeah, I really have no idea with that either. Yeah, I'm not even going to go into that. That's some mathematical stuff that we can let somebody else deal with. There's a playoff generator / simulator online that you could mess around with if you really wanted to know how that would work. So yeah, we'll leave that one alone. But let's go to our Twitter question of the week, actually, which I believe featured Josh Gordon. Ian, do you want to tell everybody about that?
Yeah, so for those who didn't hear, there was some unfortunate news for Josh Gordon in his comeback trail. He had announced early or mid last week that he was going to step away from football again to focus on his mental health. Uh, it was interesting because I believe it was the day after he actually did a full practice with the team. So it was a little bit surprising, but then the reports shortly after he made the comments of him stepping away that he was possibly facing another suspension from the NFL due to violations in his reinstatement. And he is now back on the exempt list. The question was, is it the end for Josh Gordon in the NFL, or is there a chance he might come back? And Twitter and Facebook were basically the same. On Facebook, we saw 77% of viewers saying that he is done in the NFL. Twitter said 71% yes to him being done playing it. So, Ryan, do you think this is the last we're going to see of Josh Gordon in the NFL?
It's hard to say because I would have said that this would be the last we've seen of him several times ago, like several suspensions ago should have been it for him. But he keeps finding a way to get back in. But the question is, which team would pick him up now? Because you would think the Patriots, out of all teams, with Bill Belichick, Robert Kraft, Tom Brady, has the best infrastructure to support someone like Josh Gordon that clearly needs a lot of support around him. And if they can't do it, I don't really see who could. He obviously didn't work out in Cleveland. I don't think there's any other place for him to go where he's going to be better suited than the Patriots, and he couldn't handle it, / they couldn't handle him. So I'm going to say he does not come back into the NFL.
Yeah, I don't necessarily think he comes back to the NFL. I do think he will play football again. I just don't think he'll be in the NFL. I'm not sure if he'll be in the Canadian Football League, maybe the new Allegiance of American Football, maybe the XFL in a couple of years, if he's even able to do any of that, if he's under the exempt list. But I think for some reason he's going to get one more opportunity. I just don't think it's going to be in the NFL.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of other opportunities out there for him to play organized football still in a professional way. You could even go Arena Football League at this point too, like you said, CFL. So he's going to have opportunities out there just because of his talent level, but I don't think NFL is going to work out for him. But I do wish him the best going forward and hope that he does get his life together to a point where he can be healthy.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely a lot of people care about him. It is an important note that he did want to, even though he did get suspended, he did want to obviously focus back on the mental health. So it's definitely something to keep an eye out for, just to see if anything will change from him and if he does get another chance in the NFL at some point, or if any chance in football.
So let's move on to another human interest piece that we heard about this past week. And that was actually a quote from NBA player LeBron James, who I don't have the whole quote in front of me, but actually said that NFL ownership was akin to slave owners, with a bunch of rich white men trying to tell black people what to do. So I have a pretty strong opinion on this, Ian, but I'm going to let you share first. What do you think of this quote by LeBron James? Is there any truth to it? Is it relevant? What do you have to say about it?
So I actually pulled up some of the quote. This is off of, I believe it's his HBO series that's called The Shop. What he had said in it was, in the NFL, they got a bunch of old white people or old white men owning teams, and they got that slavery mentality. And he ends up going on to say, and it's like, this is my team. You do what I tell you to do, and or we get rid of you. So first off, I think I would never expect that to come out of LeBron's mouth. He's a guy that's obviously is a social activist, obviously. And I don't know, when I first saw it, it made me a little uncomfortable, just because obviously, like, LeBron's definitely out there trying to make his point, but I had to really think about this one because, I mean, the fact that he had to go and call out a different sport, I mean, he obviously, if he says something like this in the NBA, Obviously, he gets fined, gets suspended, something crazy happens. So he calls out a different sport, and you look at obviously some of the possible reasons why this could have happened was there have been some past remarks from past owners. I believe it was the Texans' past owner last year that had made some sort of remarks in that way, or something in those lines, from what I remember. But it it's really uncomfortable to discuss this topic, I would say, just because I mean, obviously, we do see that there has been this issue come up in the NFL over the past couple of years. I mean, you look at the whole national anthem protest that was led by Colin Kaepernick and Eric Reed that has kind of sparked this conversation. And just when we thought this conversation was going away a little bit, we've seen some incidents come up that has kind of brought it back into play, and LeBron just makes this come out again. It's tough when you have an athlete in a different sport talk about it, because obviously that makes them think that their sports, in my opinion, it's not an issue. But I don't think this. Obviously, it's just really tough to talk about, and I really don't know where to go on this. I don't think he should have said that. I'm not sure if he's right or wrong about it. I just think it came out in the wrong. I'm not sure if that was where he was going with it, but also I don't think it should have been set up.
I have a pretty clear take on this one. I think that we all know by now how I stood on the protest issue. Let's investigate what LeBron said and let's take some of the truths out of it. So one truth that's very clear in this is the NFL is owned by a lot of rich white people, and they are mostly old. I will give him that one. This is true. However, what LeBron is actually talking about in relating to slavery is the idea of having a job. Ian, you and I have actual jobs. If we go out and we badmouth our company publicly, if we stand outside and tell people to not go into the company and not spend their money there, we will most likely be fired. The question here is that slavery for the owner of the company or our boss to come out and tell us that we must act in an appropriate manner or else we will not be retained? The answer to this is no. It's called being employed in America. And LeBron has been so detached from real life and society by being a star ever since he was in high school that he has no idea what having an actual job is like. He has no idea what not being catered to is actually like. And the NFL is a different thing than the NBA. The NBA has a star power to it that the NFL doesn't necessarily have because of how many more people are on the roster in the NFL. In the NBA, teams will do anything for LeBron James. We basically see him colluding with other players to come play with him, and no one says anything about this until very recently. We see him saying whatever he wants, and no one does anything about it. LeBron James could go into a building, burn it down, and nobody would do anything because he's LeBron James. So the fact that he is detached from society is not at all surprising. In the NFL, that's a roster of over 50 people. So if somebody on that roster who's not necessarily the most valuable player is doing something that is bad for your business, they're probably going to be gone. And that's just the way it is because there's more than 5 people that matter in the NFL to a particular team. So in my mind, this is not surprising at all from somebody that doesn't actually know what they're talking about or doesn't know what it's like to have a real job or have to work super hard for things without being catered to.
Yeah, it kind of makes you think too of like what would happen in case how would you think this would came out if an NFL player would have said this about like the NBA, especially if this was like a guy like Colin Kaepernick, where they call this out. If Kaepernick still had a job in the NFL, do you think that people would be thinking the same thing, or do you think it would be taken differently with Kaepernick due to the situation he's been through?
I mean, I think at this point, the constant claiming that employment at will is actually somehow akin to slavery or is racist is really getting annoying to the general population who just wants to go about their lives with being able to watch sports without having to listen to politics. So I think at this point, the general reaction to LeBron James saying this was like, LeBron, why are you doing this to us? Like, why do we have to listen to politics now coming from you? Why do you have to bring up slavery as it pertains to a business that's making other black people millionaires. Why do we have to go down this road again? And I think that would be the same if you heard it from the NBA, but it would probably have even more questions to it because the NBA players have more control than the NFL players do. I will give LeBron that too, is that element of control that the NBA has is very rare in most professional sports leagues because the players are just so much more numerous in the other sports leagues than the NBA. So I think it would be a different argument simply because it would be even stranger. But I think nonetheless it would be the same sort of why do we have to go down this road again mentality.
Yeah, and I'll be the first one to say that the first time I even heard about this, I didn't even see it on like sports media platforms. I was actually on Facebook one day when one of my friends who I talk a lot of fantasy football with kind of like shared a post and made a comment on it. Kind of, like I said, it shocked me that I heard someone from LeBron kind of like say this just because of how we've seen, like, obviously, I think the NFL has grown a little bit more this year over the past couple of years due to obviously the national anthem protests. But I don't know, it kind of makes you, it brings that topic back into discussion along with other things in the NFL. But like I said, he can't necessarily say that about the NFL just because the NFL and the NBA are completely different sports. They're ran completely different ways, and the amount of players is way off compared to the NBA. So, I mean, you look at the NBA, the amount of players in the league is about the amount of players you have on 2 or 3 teams. So, it's something that, like I said, I'm not necessarily sure if he meant to put it out that way, but as you heard me say the quote, definitely tells you that he did think about this. And the fact that he was able to say it on his own public show definitely tells you that this is not going to be the end of this conversation.
Yeah, but looking at it, let's be honest, like if somebody who's not LeBron James says this, there's probably more repercussions. There's probably more negative activity that's going to be surrounding it. Like if somebody who's a no-name player in the NBA calls out the NFL as being similar to slavery, they're probably not going to see their jersey sales go up. They're probably going to see a lot of people not wanting them on their team. I think that this is LeBron James overreaching, trying to be too woke in the current political environment. And I think eventually he's going to look back on this and say, what was I doing here? I did not help solve any of these problems with our society. I only made them worse. But let's go on to looking ahead at next week as we like to do. And let's start with our game of the week. Ian, the NFL believes the game of the week is Colts-Titans as they just moved it to their Sunday Night Football slot. Are you in agreement with that?
I mean, I thought that was going to be a good game regardless, just because it's we obviously know like that was going to have to do something in regards to the playoff push depending on what happens. And you look at Tennessee, for example, they've been playing very well these past few weeks. That's because they're finally giving the ball to Derrick Henry, a guy who had been splitting duties with Deion Lewis. So I would definitely think that is obviously like the main game you have to look out for. But I'm not saying that's going to be the game week. I'm kind of looking forward to a game that's could have some playoff indications. I'm excited to see the Browns and the Ravens. Because look at Cleveland, they have that opportunity to get over 500, and they've just looked very well, or they've played complete football, I thought, over these past couple of games. And Baltimore's coming off their biggest win of the year, propels them into possibly getting a win or a division win. And Lamar Jackson has been able to play winning football. He's not necessarily doing it with his arm. He's doing it with a little of both his arm and his legs, but he's playing well enough to lead them to wins. And I think that he's going to be able to do that and get them into the playoffs. So I think that's the game.
Okay. I think that the Titans-Colts is interesting, as well as I think that the Ravens game is interesting versus the Browns. The Ravens game will probably be entertaining. 2 running quarterbacks that can make plays with their legs. I'm looking at that Bears-Vikings game. So we talked about how the Bears could potentially rest some of their starters. They are still in contention for that 2 seed in a first-round bye, and I think that they're going to try to preserve that possibility because they play at the same time as the 49ers and the Rams. If the Rams win, the Bears don't have a chance to get a first-round bye, but they won't really know unless they're looking at the scoreboard the whole time. So I'm curious to see if the Vikings at home can stave off this Bears team that's given them a lot of trouble recently, even when the Vikings do find a way to win. And the Bears obviously have had a much better season than they typically do. I think this will be really interesting to see how hard the Bears try to keep the Vikings out of the playoffs, because if the Vikings do make it in, they're probably going right back to Soldier Field in the first week of the NFL playoffs. So that's the one I'm most interested for.
Yeah, definitely that is a key playoff game or potential playoff scenario game as well, because the Vikings do need a win, and or Chicago could possibly move up. So definitely a game that I'm also looking forward to watching and should be a big factor down the line. So Ryan, looking at our upset picks, we both did not find success this past week. The Steelers almost gave me an opportunity, and the 49ers almost came through for me as well. Who do you think would be on upset alert in the season or the regular season finale this week?
So I'm looking at ESPN.com right now, and I'm seeing that the Bills are currently a 3.5 favorite over the Dolphins. Are you seeing the same thing?
I am.
I'm picking the Dolphins.
Okay.
I like the Dolphins better than the Bills. I think they have a more complete team, even though they've struggled recently. The Bills have actually put together some nice wins this year, but I think that the Dolphins can close out the season and get to 8-8.
Yeah, very good. Yeah, I think that they have that chance to get to 8-8. I'm not sure if it'll be Adam Gase's last game or Ryan Tannehill's last game as the Dolphin, but I don't know. It's just a weird situation in Miami because they've basically been an average team the last few years, and obviously, I think they need to find a change to get above the average mark. It's just I'm not sure who's going to do it, but yeah, I definitely think that has potential to be an upset. I'm going to go with one that's currently a lower one. It's I'm going to go with Atlanta over Tampa Bay. You look at Atlanta; they're coming off of a huge win this past week. And even though it is a road matchup, I think that they're able to get the job done in some warmer weather and will go and unfortunately not make the playoffs this year. But, I mean, they'll only be one game for 500. I mean, obviously it's a disappointing year for them. But, I mean, there's been a lot of disappointments, I'd say, this year. But I think they get the win this week.
Yeah, that's also a good choice. I would think that the Falcons would be able to pull that one off if they still have enough fight left in them to finish the season. Definitely sad for a team, though, that thought they would be contending for a very high seed in the conference as opposed to playing for nothing or a draft position. But that brings us to the part of the show where we usually pick a fantasy player to pick up this week, and the vast majority of leagues are finished. So instead, we're going to do a little recap on how we did with our fantasy playoffs and our fantasy season. So, Ian, why don't you go first and tell us how you did in your multitude of fantasy leagues?
Yeah, I do want to give a couple of shout-outs first. First, Zach Torres from Chicago, Illinois, who had tweeted at us asking who to start this week in fantasy. He had asked which two running backs for PPR to start. We had said to start Jamal and Damian Williams instead of Jalen Samuels and C.J. Anderson. All those backs ended up doing a pretty good job this week. So even if he didn't go with them, any of those options would have been good. We also saw Ryan Leisenring. He also tweeted at us out of Michigan asking about Jalen Samuels or Travis Kelce. We had said Samuels. Samuels did score this week, so definitely a good pick if you did ride with him. But, yeah, looking at my fantasy seasons, it was a little bit up and down. I mean, I made the playoffs in all but one of my leagues. I did make the championship in one of my leagues. Unfortunately, I was going against the number one seed who's been averaging over 170 points per week, and he ended up scoring over 180 this week against me.
Ooh.
So I was not able to pull off the win in that one. I was not able to reclaim my money in my paid league. I lost in the third place game. So unfortunately, it wasn't a winning. I did not find a successful year, but I mean, I made the playoffs in 5 of my leagues, so I'm going to take that as a slight pick. Sure.
Danny, and that's rough.
How about you, Ryan? Were you able to? I know you usually do 2 leagues. I know you said you were in the playoffs. Both. Were you able to find so much success?
Yeah, so I actually won both of my fantasy leagues that I was in this year, which is very shocking, especially since one of my teams was the 4th seed. One was the top seed, but scored like the 7th most points total all year, so I thought I would lose in the first round. But I was lucky enough to pick up Damian Williams in one of my leagues, who I started this week, and he really went off actually with over 100 yards and a receiving touchdown with 37 more yards receiving. And in my other league, I picked up Derrick Henry somewhat early on, so I was able to ride him smooth sailing to the finish. So it's been a good fantasy year for me, so that's been exciting.
Yeah, definitely. And I was glad to see that in our league, I did not take last place. For the 3rd time this year, I was able to beat Kelly, so I avoid last place this year.
Yep, shout out to Kelly's Bald team, whom you've been able to dispatch several times and avoided finishing in last place. So that is definitely exciting. Yeah. Also, shout out to Neil Johnson, whose team somehow scored 143 points after averaging like 70 points all year.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. Also, shout out to him because I wonder what his Vikings have a chance to make the playoffs. So, I mean, he'll probably be pretty happy if they make it. I mean, if you haven't read his NFL Rants page on Facebook, it's very interesting to read, especially after a tough Vikings loss. So if you aren't friends with him on Facebook, I would try friending him and reading his NFL Rant articles each week.
Yeah, definitely. Always worth a read after Vikings loss. If the Vikings win, I skip the first paragraph and just head on to the cold-blooded stats. But yeah, that is the show that we have for you today. We hope to see you next week. And Ian, is there anything else you want to add before we let everyone get going?
Yeah, I just want to wish everyone a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays. Make sure you're able to spend it with family and friends. We thank you for listening to our holiday edition of Touchdown Tuesdays, the official football podcast of Brew Sports. Make sure to give us a listen each week on either iTunes, Google Play, or Spreaker by searching Touchdown Tuesdays. Feel free to give us a like on our social media pages on either Facebook or Twitter. If you are looking us up on Twitter, use the handle at TDWN2's podcast. I'm pretty sure we're just around 130 likes or follows on Twitter, 90 likes on Facebook. Make sure to go to Facebook, get us over that 100 mark. Feel free to, like I said, tweet or Facebook us each week, and we can get your comments or questions on next week's show. And also look out for our basketball podcast, Run It Back, each week, talking about the NBA as well. And keep an eye out for our question of the week as well. But again, thanks everyone for listening this week. And like I said, have a happy holiday.